Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well.
Hi.
I want to quickly recap what we talked about last time because we kind of rounded out our discussion of Rambam, with whom we started at the beginning of this year. And I want to transition after a brief summary into the later medieval Jewish philosophers and how they deviated from Rambam. And we started doing that a little bit with a discussion of Shapiro's article. But just let's recap Rambam very quickly so that we can see how the later medieval Jewish philosophers deviated from Rambam's influence, starting with Reb Shimon ben Samach Duran, who we're going to discuss today. But first, just a quick recap. We asked at the beginning of the series, we asked a series of questions about the nature, your conceptions of the nature of dogma in Judaism. And we can now answer them at least according to Rambam. So we asked initially, are we obligated exclusively in our actions? Are there obligatory beliefs as well? For Rambam, he would say there are 13 obligatory beliefs that he derives or interprets based on the Mishnah and Sanhedrin. And so he enumerates each of these 13, the first 5 dealing with principles about God, God's existence, unity, and corporeality, etc. The next 4 dealing with something related to prophecy, revelation, and the last 4 dealing with retribution, some form of divine and punishment, and more specifically with Yimot HaMashiach and Tchiyat HaMetim. We then asked the question, are they universally accepted? And when I asked the question in general, the only specific dogma that people pointed to were Rambam's Yud Gimel Karim. So even if they weren't universally accepted, they definitely seem to have more of a pervasive influence than dogma that has been delineated by any other of the Jewish philosophers. And then we asked the final 2 questions. If these beliefs are obligatory and they're denied, is one punished? Can one be punished? Would it be the same as if you're violating halacha? And then we asked a bit of a more nuanced question with regard to intentions. If you don't intend to deny, but you end up denying because you erroneously held a mistaken conception and therefore came to go against one of the Karim, would you be considered a heretic? Meaning, is there a distinction between B'mezid and B'shogeg like there is in halacha? Is that true for dogma or for beliefs or for theological conceptions as well? And so Rambam, we saw last class, the end of his Yud Gimel Karim, he seems to imply that if you sin by kind of succumbing to your base instincts in any way, you need to do tshuva, but you're not excluded from Klal Yisrael. However, if you doubt, if you deny, even accidentally, any of these 13 ikarim, then you're out. Then you lose your chelik in Olam Haba. And so we saw that according to Rabbi Bleich, who we quoted last session, he says that according to Rambam, these seem to be simple and basic theological truths, which are kind of like the minimal prerequisites, the minimal degree of knowledge sufficient to assure a chelik in Olam Haba. And so one needs to not only profess these 13, but one needs to have some sort of intellectual grasp on these 13 theological conceptions as kind of a minimum entrance requirement to Olam Haba, because in Rambam's conception, Olam Haba is this intellectual, spiritual state, and without such prerequisites, one is not going to be able to be sustained in such a state. So one needs to develop one's intellect, as we saw Rambam's 4th and ultimate level of human perfection, in order to merit and sustain oneself in the spiritual plane of Olam Haba. So rather than seeing this as a very harsh punishment, it's more of a consequence. If you lack the intellectual preparation, you're not going to be able to survive in Olam Haba. Now we saw also from Shapiro's article, and we also looked specifically at Ravid's quote from the commentary on the Mishnah Torah. Ravid says, who are you, Rambam, right, to call such a person an Afikoros, right? There's many people greater than you that literally understood anthropomorphisms in the Torah. And when it says that God took Bnei Israel out, they took that literally and thereby came to some corporeal conception of God. And such individuals are not and should not be considered heretics. So we see with that example from the Raavad, the most familiar example that's in his commentary on Rambam's Mishnah Torah, but from many, many others that were also quoted in Shapiro's article, and Shapiro entitles his article, 13 Principles, the Last Word in Jewish Theology, ? Shapiro argues that these traditional Jewish sources, many, both Rishonim and Achronim, argue against many of the theological propositions that Rambam enumerates in the Yud Gimel Karim. So Shapiro argues that this is not the last word in Jewish theology, and the fact that Rambam, just as Shapiro writes, places the stamp of apostasy on anyone who disagreed with his principles, that didn't frighten many Rishonim and Achronim from arguing against the authority of Rambam's Yud Gimel Karim. Okay, so that's what, yeah, Mark, please.
A quick question now. I mean, ultimately, was this, in essence, a argument or controversy between Rambam's Aristotelian rationalization approach and everyone else's quote unquote traditional approach? Or was there, truly, many more ideas and thoughts about this whole subject that were percolating around at the time?
There's so much speculation, and Shapiro quotes Arthur Hyman in his article on Maimonides quotes so many different theories about what motivated Rambam to write his Yud Gimel Karim. We're going to mention one in just a minute from Menachem Kellner. Was it motivated in order just to defend oneself against the earlier Muslim claims, then later the Christian attacks and persecution? Was it just an elaboration of the Mishnah? Was it an attempt to allow the conversos to feel at least they needed to maintain some semblance of their theology if they had, already kind of been coerced to relinquish any sort of, physical practice of Judaism? So there's so many speculations. Some argue that Rambam believed that without the proper conceptions, just like Bachya was saying, you can't have the proper physical observance. And so therefore, if you, conceive of God in corporeal terms, by praying to him, you would be, worshiping Avodah Zarah. So there are lots of different, from a political perspective, from a historical perspective, from a metaphysical perspective, from a theological perspective, lots of different explanations or speculations as to what motivated Rambam to write these Yud Gimel Karim and why he wrote it in this particular way, more than just saying, well, it was just, according to the structure, of the Mishnah. But I think, and this Menachem Kellner suggests in a kind of a generous explanation to Rambam, even though it might be thought that by laying down the principles of faith, he was really kind of excluding people from the community of Israel, meaning whoever failed to accept his Yud Gimel Karim, and therefore Rambam was trying to kind of narrow who should be considered a Jew. Really, one could see it in the reverse way, right? Remembering Rambam's apparently secret life, his own personal life in North Africa and his family's concern for the forced conversions, it's possible that Rambam was seeking to define as good Jews those who remain faithful, at least, internally, even if their outward practice, were even in their outward practice, if they were being like forced to deviate from halacha. And so the principles could be seen as a method not of excluding as many Jews as possible from the fold, but rather as including as many Jews as possible within the community of Israel. So if Rambam wanted the masses to adopt correct beliefs, he needed to at least enforce this in pretty strong terms, right? It couldn't be too laissez-faire about, okay, well, whoever, if you want, you can't, but if he wanted them at least to kind of correct any of their erroneous conceptions, he still needed to kind of take a hard and fast line. And therefore, he wrote that conclusion in the Perush Mishnayot, if anyone denies even one of them, you lose your chelik in olam haba. So we talked about last time the distinction that Rambam makes between true beliefs and necessary beliefs in the Moreh Nevuchim, and Shapiro argues that may have been the motivation, at least kind of scare them into submission as like kind of a necessary belief, not necessarily as a true belief, as a philosophically accurate belief. So it's not necessarily clear, and there's a lot of Maimonidean scholars that debate whether Rambam actually felt that these 13 Ikarim were obligatory, whether Rambam really believed that this was an exhaustive list whatsoever, if he was just kind of using the structure of the Mishnah to kind of delineate kind of paradigmatic beliefs that really represented many more beliefs that were also, included in the foundations of the Torah. So it's not clear that Maimonides himself believed that these 13 beliefs, or at least, the latter kind of from 6 to 13, had some sort of like more saving type of power than all of the other teachings of the Torah. We're going to see that Durant argues against this later today. But Rambam may have felt that in order to accomplish his ends, he had to adopt the claim that Judaism had dogma, especially because Islam was pervasive and influential in his time, and Islam had their dogma. And so similarly, Judaism needed to have its dogma, and the Jews needed to be able to have one uniform acceptance of the beliefs for themselves to strengthen their own convictions, as well as to defend themselves against the attacks from others. So what we can see was interesting. So Menachem Kellner wrote a book that was raised some controversy. It's called Must a Jew Believe Anything? And it's very accessible in the way that he writes it. And he argues, and we'll discuss in the last Shira together, he makes a pretty provocative claim that was objected to by many people, many scholars within the contemporary Orthodox Jewish world, and we'll see why when we get to that after we look at the next few philosophers. But in the book also, specific to Rambam, Menachem Kellner makes the claim, he writes, the impact of Maimonides' position, that in short, Judaism has dogmas in the strictest sense of the word, was monumental and pervasive, while at the same time negligible. What do you think Kellner means by that? I'll read it again. He says, the impact of Maimonides' position, that in short, Judaism has dogmas in the strictest sense of the word, was monumental and pervasive, while at the same time negligible. What do you make of that kind of dialectic? That it was monumental and pervasive, yet negligible. How do you understand that? Go ahead. Right.
So from a philosophical standpoint, it was earth-shaking, in terms of really coming up with a dogma and fitting any type of dogma within this Jewish philosophy was in fact quite revolutionary, for lack of a better way of saying it. But it didn't have practical impact on the vast majority of people because their day-to-day lives, it really, nobody really thought about that when it came to their daily practice.
Okay, so we never saw any systematized, these are beliefs. We had, a theological conception, in the Torah here, something in rabbinic literature there, but nothing systematized and nothing that was said explicitly, these are obligatory. If you don't believe in these, you're going to lose your chelek in olam haba, as we do with, the majority of the Aseret HaDibros, where there's clear consequences, it's in imperative form, as opposed to these, where we don't see anything explicit like that in terms of our belief. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Again, it's not explicit. It's not an explicit command. And we'll talk about the distinction between a command versus a principle a little bit later as well. So it's revolutionary in the sense that we didn't have any before this, even if things were implied, as Rambam would argue, that he wasn't innovating anything, even if things were implied in the Torah or in Chazal, we didn't have any systematic delineation of, or an exhaustive list of these are obligatory beliefs that was anything similar to these are the obligatory halachot that every Jew understands is part of our religious obligation. So that was certainly revolutionary. And the idea of the pervasiveness, even, when I asked you at the beginning of this year, at the beginning of the series, how do you perceive of dogma? And I think Vivian mentioned the anima means, I think Mark, you mentioned yigdal, right? So there was some influence of Rambam and not of any other Jewish philosopher, any other system of dogma. So certainly there was a pervasiveness, just the fact that it's, still within our liturgy says something, but yet it's negligible. And it's negligible, I think, for many reasons. And we're going to see for the next 2 centuries, there's really no philosophers that really talk about this. In addition to that, many people disagreed with Rambam. Rambam took a pretty harsh stance, especially with regard to the obligatory nature, and especially with regard to the idea that there's no distinction between deliberate or accidental heresy. So there's many, including what we've already seen with Ravid, and another one we're going to see later today. There's many that don't agree with Rambam's stance in terms of the obligatory nature or the fact that there's no exception for intention. And also just the superficial impact of Rambam. Yes, it was pervasive in the sense that we say in the Ani Ma'amins of the Yigdals, and even though that might preserve the spirit of Rambam's idea, right, they really simplify very philosophically sophisticated concepts, right? By just saying Ani Ma'amin b'emunah shlema or Yigdal lo Amchai v'shtabach, right, you're not really accepting the form of each of the theological principles that Rambam intended. And we saw in Shapiro's article, when we discussed that last year, that many people, we're going to see Kreskas next week, we'll see Duran this week, objected to Maimonides' views, specifically that the Torah commands beliefs when that's, beyond human control, and some of the other specifics that Rambam believes are obligatory. And we see both before Rambam and after Rambam, other Jewish philosophers like Sadia and Bachya, who lived before Rambam, they also believed that the Torah taught explicit theological beliefs, but they deviated from Rambam regarding the obligatory nature of them. They didn't feel that it's an obligation for an individual to philosophically investigate them, or that these beliefs should define who is and is not included within Klal Yisrael, or they didn't feel that punishment should be threatened for those who denied, especially accidentally. So we see, like with Sajigon in Sefer Amunot B'Dayot, he does believe that there are beliefs that Jews should hold, but this is for Sadia a reshut, not an obligation. And we saw in the first source that we looked at in the very first class together, we talked about Bachya and the Chovot Levavot. He says in his day, everybody just wrote about the Chovot Evarim, the halachot, the obligations of the limbs, and people weren't focused on the Chovot Levavot. He does argue, like Rambam, that the Chovot Levavot were obligatory, but he says it's only obligatory for those who are intellectually capable, as opposed to Rambam, who says everybody has this obligation, and if you don't, have the proper understanding, you're excluded from Olam Haba. So we see for many, many reasons, Rambam's influence was somewhat negligible despite the monumental nature of his delineation. And the whole discussion of dogma was largely ignored in the next 2 centuries after Rambam published the Pirush Mishnayot. And it was only revisited in the 15th century in Iberia in defense of Judaism against the Christian persecutions. And again, after the expulsion until the Haskalah and the beginning of the Reform movement in the end of the 18th century. And so it was only revisited, the whole discussion of principles of faith was only revisited by those Jewish philosophers in the 15th century who were not only Jewish philosophers, but also had rabbinic and communal responsibilities. So these philosophers were Shimon ben Samach Duran, who we'll discuss today, Chastai Kreskas, Yosef Albo, and Isaac Abravanel. And so we see that those who lived in the next 2 centuries after Rambam, who were just philosophers, they weren't interested in this question. This question was more for those who were dealing with apologetics, who were dealing with communal pressures, who were dealing with defense against persecution and other spiritual attacks. And so there's very little discussion between Rambam's time. Rambam died in the 13th century. In the very, very beginning of the 13th century, there wasn't much discussion until the end of the 1300s, meaning the end of the 14th century. And it was because of the persecution that the Iberian Jewish community was facing, and the assault not only on them as Jews and on their physical practice, but also the assault on their theology. That is what motivated these Jewish philosophers, who were also rabbinic leaders, who were also political leaders, to delineate different systems of beliefs in Judaism so that, again, they could attempt to do what Rambam failed to ultimately influence, meaning Rambam's influence was somewhat impactful but short-lived, and therefore even in the 14th century, there still wasn't this uniform acceptance of beliefs and the principles like Rambam had hoped, and therefore the Jewish leaders in those times felt the need to delineate what could be what could be well accepted by all of the Jews, and in an effort to defend themselves against their persecutors. So many thousands of Jews were coerced to convert, and the Jewish communal leadership were therefore motivated to teach the generation how to defend themselves in the face of the attacks of the church, and how to define who a Jew was in the face of the converso problem, and how to strengthen the faith of the Jews who refused to convert. Now we see in this time, just for those of you who are familiar with what was going on in Jewish history at this time, there were the disputations. And in Jewish history, that was an extremely challenging times for the Jews that lasted many years. The first disputation, which was held in Paris, that was in 1240. Nicholas Donin, who was a Jewish apostate, argued against Judaism, while Yechiel ben Yosef represented the Jewish community, and that disputation resulted in the burning of the Talmud. Later in 1263, in a disputation held in Barcelona, Pablo Cristiani converted. He was a Jew who converted to Christianity. He engaged in a confrontation against Ramban. And with these disputations as precedent, Yosef Albo was called to defend the Talmud and Judaism against Geronimo de Santa Fe in a third disputation in Tortosa in 1413. And each of these disputations were inaugurated by the Pope, and they would kind of put the Talmud on trial, and they would have these rabbis defend the Talmud against the accusations by the Christians. And it wasn't a fair trial. It was clearly, there were clear motives. And Yosef Albo, who defended the Talmud and was one of the leaders in the Jewish community in this time, in the 15th century, he felt the need, because he saw, when he was dealing with all of these other rabbis who were defending the Talmud and defending the Jews against the attacks of the Christians, he felt that there wasn't uniformity even amongst the rabbis in terms of what were the authoritative, universally accepted beliefs in Judaism. And certainly if it wasn't uniform amongst the rabbis, it wasn't uniform amongst the generation, his co-religionists, and therefore he sought to counteract the propaganda by convincing the Jews that only by yielding to God and only by understanding the proper beliefs can one defend themselves in a universal and an effective way. And so the Tortosa disputation revealed to Albo that there was such a need, and that he felt, and he writes in the Sefer Karim, which we'll look in a couple of classes, that there wasn't sufficient traction with regard to Rambam's Gibul Karim and with his other philosophical predecessors, and therefore because he wasn't afforded an opportunity to respond adequately to his accuser during the disputation, he felt the need to formulate a commonly accepted system of dogma. And so it was as a result of the disputation that he set out to combat these philosophical, theological confusions and write one accessible book for his suffering generation that they would all use to fortify themselves and to defend themselves against accusations. But before we get to Albo, and this is why I want to do it in this order, before we get to Albo, I want to look at a lesser known, but particularly influential Jewish philosopher, and that's Shimon ben Semach Duran. Duran lived from 1361 to 1444, so he was a contemporary of Yosef Albo. But Yosef Albo's book, Sefer Karim, had far, far, far greater popularity. And therefore, much of the system of dogma that Yosef Albo gets credit for was really influenced by Shimon ben Semach Duran. And you'll see why. We'll look at two of his texts today together. Now, Rashbaz, that's his acronym, is better known for his shutim, for his responsa. He was a halachist in addition to a Jewish philosopher. And so he was a rabbinic leader at this time. He was born in Mallorca, and then he had to flee in 1391 because of the attacks. He fled to North Africa, and he became the chief rabbi of Tlemcen, I think is how you pronounce it. And he was one of the leaders of the North African Jewish community. And because he was also a leading halachist, he's more well known for his responsa, the response of the Rashbaz, than for his philosophy. But he incorporates a system of dogma, and he shows the influence of Rambam where he perpetuates Rambam's influence and where he deviates from it in two of his philosophical works. One work is called the Ohev Mishpat, which is a perush on Eov, and the other work is called the Magen Avot, which is a perush on Avot. Okay, so have a look first at, I'm going to share my screen with you. Have a look first at the Magen Avot. And so what we're going to see with Duran, and this is going to be influential with the next three that we look at as well, Chasdai, Kreskas, Yosef Albo, and Bravanel, we see Rambam's influence clearly, but what we see with these philosophers is a hierarchical structure. Rambam says, here are these 13, and there doesn't seem to be a distinction in terms of, are some more important than others, or some obligatory, or some not. We're going to see a hierarchy with these three later Jewish philosophers that use Rambam as a springboard and then jump off from there. So in the Magen Avot, Shimon ben Samach Duran writes the following. This is in his Hakdama. He says, we've learned in the Mishnah, and he quotes the same Mishnah from Sanhedrin that Rambam quotes when he writes in his Perush Mishnayot, the 13 Ikarim. He says, we've learned in the Mishnah, all Israel have a portion in the world to come, but the following have no portion therein. He who maintains the resurrection is not a biblical doctrine. The Torah was not divinely revealed in an Apikoros, right? Same thing from the Mishnah. Okay, so he says here, I now commence to explain it in Tractate Avot, as I've set myself to do with God's help. I've divided this book into 4 parts. In the first part, I refute the opinions of the Apikorim. I've divided it into 5 chapters. 1, God's existence. 2, his unity. 3, incorporeality. 4, that he's eternal. And to this, I added that he ought to be worshipped. 5, divine attributes. These 5 principles are included under Apikoros, mentioned in the Mishnah, for he who denies them is an Apikoros. Okay, so we see first, this is the same as Rambam in the Mishnah, in the Perush Mishnayot, right? There, he's using the same reverse order as Rambam did. The Apikoros shows you those who deny these 5 would be considered an Apikoros. Therefore, inverting it, one must believe in these 5 Ikarim. The second part relates to the statement the Torah was not divinely revealed. And he says, I've divided into 4 chapters: prophecy, Mosaic prophecy, revelation, and eternity of the Torah. Again, the same system as Rambam, relating to the second part of the Mishnah, he who denies Torah min hashamayim. And then the third part relates to the one who says that resurrection was not taught in the Torah. And this he divides into 4 chapters: God's knowledge, providence, reward and punishment, days of the Messiah, resurrection of the dead. Okay, so again, same as we saw in the Mishnah, in the Perush Mishnayot, Rambam says anybody who denies the term Tchiyat Metim is from the Torah, right? He delineates those last 4 Ikarim. But this is what Duran says, and this is the influence that we're going to see he has on Albo. He says, these are the 3 principles which earlier scholars summarized in the verse, and that the land be not desolate. Revelation, reward and punishment, God's existence. These are the foundations of the Torah. For it is the foundation of the faith to believe in God, in his existence, unity, eternity, incorporeality, and that he ought to be worshipped. This is included under the rubric of Apikoros from the Mishnah. And this, it is the foundation of the Torah to believe in the prophecy of the prophets, in the prophecy of Moshe and the Torah and its eternity. This is included under the rubric of the Torahs from heaven. And this is the foundation of the Torah to believe in reward and punishment and its branches. This is included under the rubric of resurrection. So what Duran does, and he explains, there's only 3 principles of the Torah. He makes a hierarchy. There are 3 principles: existence of God, revelation, and reward and punishment. And all of the other kind of derivative principles are under these larger rubrics. So he takes Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim, which we saw Rambam delineates based on the structure of the Mishnah, but he condenses them into only 3 Ikarim. And we're going to see Albo uses the 3 Ikarim. Albo develops it a little bit further, both in terms of these are Ikarim of all religions, not just Judaism. And then he further delineates the derivative categories, what Albo is going to say, the Shorashim, the branches, the roots, the Anafim, the branches. And he further distinguishes which are specific to Judaism, which are obligatory, which are just meritorious. But we see the beginnings, the influence that Albo kind of further develops, we see from Duran. Duran basically takes Rambam's 13 Ikarim, condenses them into 3 categories, and he says there are 3 principles of Judaism. And these he takes from the structure of the Yud Gimel Ikarim. Now, what Duran then does is a major deviation. And so with regard, however, so up until now, he's stuck with Rambam, at least with regard to these 3 categories that then he explains specifically represent the rest of Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim. But the major deviation comes here. In his other work, where he discusses dogma, and this is his Perush on Iyov, in Ohev Mishpat, he says the following: you also ought to know that one who has properly accepted the roots of the Torah, but was moved to deviate from them by the depths of his speculation, and who thereby came to believe concerning one of the branches of the faith, the opposite of what has been accepted as what one ought to believe, and tried to explain the verses of scripture according to his belief, even though he errs, he is no denier. For he is not brought to this deviation by heresy at all. And if he found a tradition from the sages to the effect that he ought to turn from the position he had adopted, he would do so. He only holds that belief because he thinks it's in the intention of the Torah. Therefore, even though he errs, he is not a denier and sectarian according to what is agreed upon by our people, since he has accepted the roots of the Torah as he should. So he makes a couple of interesting observations here. Number one, he totally goes against Rambam. Rambam says there's no distinction between B'shogeg or B'mezid, and Duran is saying no, just like in halacha, shkaga matters, just like in halacha, your intentions matter. If you do something inadvertently or unintentionally, you're not punished in the same way as if you did it deliberately. So too in theology, so too in your machshavot, in your conceptions, right? If you properly accepted the roots of the Torah, but based on your speculation, based on your reading, based on your analysis, based on your philosophy, you came to believe in something that was different than what you ought to believe, and you were well-intended, you tried to explain the verse in scripture according to that belief, even though you're in error, you need to rectify that belief, you need to rectify your misconception. You're not a denier because you were not doing this intentionally, you were not doing this heretically, and if you knew that it should be otherwise, you would change it. But you only do this because you think it's within the intention of the Torah. And so he says at the very end there, even though he errs, he's not a denier, since he has accepted the roots of the Torah as he should. So we see that Duran totally goes against what Maimonides was saying with regard to accidental heresy. Now, Duran makes an important distinction between principles and commandments. He says how commandments are independent, and if one is abolished, it wouldn't affect the rest of the Torah. But commandments depend on the Torah, not vice versa. Commandments are found explicitly in the Torah. Principles, on the other hand, are not. The Torah doesn't command belief in specific principles. Acceptance of the Torah implies acceptance of the principles. So with regard to the principles, if one was abolished, the whole Torah would collapse. So for Duran, the principles of the Torah are interrelated and basic to the existence of the Torah. And therefore, if you knowingly deny any belief of the Torah, for Duran, you're denying the whole Torah. So heresy doesn't depend for Duran on the affirmation or the denial of one specific belief like it does for Maimonides. But if you intend to rebel, then the deliberate denial of any belief constitutes heresy. But if you don't intend to rebel, then denial of no specific belief would constitute heresy. And so that's what he means at the end there when he says, even though he errs, he's not a denier, according to what is agreed upon by our people, since he had accepted the roots of the Torah as he should. So if you accept, if you believe, if you affirm the principles of the Torah, even if you inadvertently deny one of them, you don't lose your chelek and olam haba. So this is a radical difference from what Rambam says and the stance Rambam takes. So even though, again, we can see kind of the dialectic that Kellner was talking about, on the one hand, in Duran's philosophy, Rambam is extraordinarily influential, right? He uses a very similar system and just kind of condenses it. On the other hand, the influence is somewhat negligible because he totally deviates and reverses Maimonides' conception of the obligatory nature of the principles of beliefs with regard to the specific and explicit affirmation of each individual principle, and specifically with regard to inadvertent heresy or accidental heresy. That's a major, major difference from what we saw from Rambam's whole motivation of kind of either scaring the population into submission. We see with Duran, and we're going to see later with Albo as well, a much more lenient stance where intentions really do matter. And it's not just about what one can philosophically develop oneself to affirm or what one doesn't. We're going to see, however, that Duran was not, completely influential. And even though we're going to see he certainly was influential with regard to accidental heresy on Yosef Albo, there were others that disagreed with his stance. And have a look here at Abraham Bibago in the Derech Emunah. So look at what he says in response to the Ravid's objection to Rambam and also to Duran's objection to Rambam with regard to accidental heresy. He said, the Ravid's statement is really amazing to me. Again, just to remind you, the Ravid said, who are you, Rambam, to say that somebody who takes the Torah literally and believes in the corporeality of God is a heretic? Many people greater than you took the Agadot literally and believed that God, or conceived of God in corporeal terms. Now, Ravid is not saying that he himself believed in God's corporeality, but he said that this was a pervasive belief, not only among the masses in Rambam's day, but was pervasive even among scholars and even among rabbinic figures who took the Torah and who took the Gadotot literally. So Bibago argues against Ravid and against Duran's stance with regard to accidental heresy. And Bibago says the following: Ravid's statement is really amazing to me, since if it were correct, everyone who denied a principle without meaning to do so would have an excuse and a portion in the world to come. Even the belief of the Christians would not be inconsistent with true felicity, since they understand scripture literally and think that the intention of the verse is as they believe it. On this basis, they would not be called heretics and sectarians. It would be possible to find a man who does not believe in any one of the principles or beliefs of the Torah because of his failure to understand the meaning of the Torah. On this position, such a one would be called neither a sectarian nor a heretic. All this opposes reason and faith. So Bibago is taking this pretty far, and he's saying you can't have this kind of leniency where, well, if you're not intended, if you don't, if you're misdirected based on your speculation or based on your philosophy, then it's all okay. It's all okay. There has to be some parameters. You can't just say, then you would be able to say, oh, the Christians, well, they're well intended. They're entitled to their beliefs, and it's not heretical. There has to be some parameters of what should and what shouldn't be included, be permissible, be an appropriate conception. And so Bibago argues against both Ravid and also Duran by arguing that intentions can matter, but ultimately, if you have the wrong conception, it's heretical. And it can't just be like, oh, well, you can kind of deviate or follow any speculation and it's all good as long as you don't, explicitly intend to rebel. Abravanel, who we're going to discuss in a couple of weeks, brings up an important analogy, I think, that helps kind of heighten Bibago's argument or objection against Duran. And Abravanel says the following, again, agreeing with Bibago and with Rambam. He says, these things are intolerable according to both the faith of Torah and correct reason. For a false doctrine about any one of the principles of faith turns the soul from its true felicity and will not bring one to life in the world to come, even if the opinion is held without intention to rebel. It's like poison which consumes the spirit of him who eats it, even if he ate it thinking that it was good and healthy food. Similarly, heresy and false belief in the matter of principles of religion will expel the soul of man and without a doubt make it impossible for him to inherit the world to come. Now, when we look at Abarbanel in a couple of weeks, we'll see that he certainly was extraordinarily influenced by Rambam, but he does deviate from Rambam in important ways. However, with regard to accidental heresy, he is furthering Rambam and Babago's point, right? He's saying you can't say that as long as you're not intending to rebel, you can kind of assimilate or adopt any inappropriate, false doctrine. And he gives an analogy. He says, it's like poison which consumes the spirit of someone who eats it, even if he ate it thinking that it was a good and healthy food. Similarly, heresy and false beliefs in the matter of principles of religion will expel the soul of man and without a doubt make it impossible for him to inherit the world to come. Meaning, I could eat something thinking that it was healthy, yet it still would be physically corruptive to my body. Similarly, I could believe something through my philosophical speculation or from my erroneous conceptions, and it will be just as spiritually damaging to me as that poisonous food is physically to my body. And therefore, Abravanel is furthering the point of the Bago and Rambam with regard to accidental heresy. If you have the wrong conception, there are consequences to that. If you don't believe in God properly, you're not going to be able to worship him properly, even if you were well-intended when you obtained that erroneous conception. You're still going to be praying to a physical God if you believe, even well-intended, that the anthropomorphisms in the Torah are to be understood literally. So we see from this kind of dispute, Duran is furthering the perspective of the Ravid and giving legitimacy and leniency to the intentions of the individual. And if you're well-intended and you believe in the Torah and believe in the principles of the Torah, even if you deviate because you were led in the wrong direction, either by you or by others, it's okay. You need to do tshuva, you need to correct your erroneous perception, but you're not a denier. Abravanel is furthering the points of Babago, who's furthering the points of Rambam, saying no, intentions are not so significant. If you have the wrong perception, you're not going to be able to conceive of God properly. And for Rambam, that would mean you're not going to be able to achieve the L'chelek in Olam Haba. So I'd just like to hear your reactions with regard to this debate about heresy. Do you find the perspectives of Babago, Abravanel, and Rambam persuasive? Or do you feel that what Duran is contributing to this discussion, furthering the point of Ravid, that there needs to be that same distinction between deliberate versus accidental, as there is in halacha, and that needs to be implied to imachshabot as well. And therefore, regardless of your beliefs, as long as you are well-intended to believe in the Torah, it doesn't really matter if you come to an erroneous perception. Anyone want to share their reflections, their thoughts? Not all at once.
I think that can be a dangerous and slippery slope to go down. Because it's not a fun.
Which one, Duran's?
Duran's, yeah. Because it's not fundamental to almost every element of our Jewish faith. It's just about trying. It's about doing what you're obligated to do. And while intention is obviously a very critical element of what we do and how we do it, and we can get into arguments about what halachot we have to have intention on and what halachot we don't have to have intention on. Fundamentally speaking, it's not have a good feel about it, and and then if you get it right, good for you.
So how do you feel about the distinction, let's say, if Sajigon says it's the reshut, but it's not an obligation, or it's an obligation for those who are intellectually prepared, but it's not necessarily an obligation for everybody.
Yeah. So I'm saying that's my point. My point is no. I mean, that there's no, at the end of the day, there's no distinction. There's no religion that's only a religion for those who can apprehend and those who cannot. Everyone has the exact same set of obligations. It's not 613 mitzvot for you, but only 606 for me. I mean, there is, but I'm saying, but not for these reasons.
Right.
So, my take would be that you have to make some effort, and if you've made some effort, if you make a mistake, then you're not a heretic. But if you don't make sufficient intellectual effort, then you're likely to make many more mistakes and many more serious mistakes. So I think it depends on the amount of effort that you make. That's.
How do you gauge that though?
I think it's impossible to give some definitive standard. I would. It's terribly hard.
I'll give you an example though. So some Maimonidean scholars argue with regard to Rambam's conception of divine providence. Yaakov, I see your hand. You can speak in 1 minute. Okay. So Rambam talks about divine providence, and so according to Rambam, when we talked about this a couple of classes ago, according to Rambam, the more one develops one's intellect, the more he will achieve or merit divine providence. And that's understood in different ways. Like Garth, I think you asked about this a couple of weeks ago and we talked about it a little bit. So some Maimonidean scholars argue that if Mark might have a much greater intellectual capacity than I do, but if Mark chooses not to develop his intellect, and even though my intellectual capacity is much more limited than Mark's, but I choose to develop to the small extent that I can, that my capacity allows. If I choose to develop my intellect, but Mark, who has a much greater capacity, chooses not to, I will be zoche, divine providence. I will merit God's providence, whereas Mark wouldn't because he had that capacity, but didn't actualize it. Right. So you could say, Garth, maybe you would say it might be, whereas Bachya would say only, the elites have the obligation to, and the rest, don't. And again, we're going to see next week with Kreskas, he argues, it can't be that the beliefs are what's obligatory because God wouldn't make Olam Haba, or God wouldn't make immortality only achievable by the intellectual elite, right? So it could be, Garth, you're saying, everybody just needs to put forth their efforts according to their individual capacity. And Rambam does make that distinction in the very final chapter of Morning Bukhim when he talks about human perfection. He does say according to human capacity, which might be different, for each individual. But it's hard to kind of give, like a hard and fast, line. This is what you need to do in order to get, so Rambam, especially in the Perush Mishnah, which is intended for the masses, he kind of says this is it. Everyone's got to do it. This is the prerequisites, and then this is what's expected. This is obligatory. So kind of saying, well, everybody has to kind of exert their own efforts according to their capacity gives a lot more room for discretion. Yaakov, what did you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems to me that Duran probably does go too far, because I think the points are right. Yeah, the Christians believe they're correctly interpreting the Torah also. It's just it's a very different interpretation. But I wonder if maybe what's needed is some sort of as in there's the principles for deduction from the Torah, like there's 13 principles, if something needs to be applied here. And maybe if those principles are properly constructed, it prevents someone from taking the roots of the Torah and ending up at Christianity. But if someone is, trying to honestly follow those principles, but because of their lack of intellectual capacity or because some of these concepts are, very deep and not necessarily the answer is clear from the Torah, maybe then that could still be a valid form of intellectual discourse.
Mm-hmm.
We need some sort of guidelines on how to get there.
Right. We're going to see Yosef Albo next in 2 weeks is very much influenced by Duran, not only in these 3 principles of faith and not only in kind of his hierarchical structure of the rest of his Yugim Karim, but he also follows Duran with regard to accidental heresy and is lenient about that, says such a person isn't a denier. He's just well-intended and he's in error and he needs to do tshuva, but he's not a heretic. But he does, and I don't know, Yaakov, if you'll be satisfied with this, we'll look at it in a couple of weeks, but he does kind of delineate specific ways where the person goes astray that would be considered an accidental heretic. So maybe by kind of giving a bit more like formalized parameters, I wouldn't say it's a middle ground position between, you know, the Rambam, Bibago, Abarbanel state versus the Duran Ravid state. It's definitely much more towards the Duran side, but at least he gives a little bit more structure to what is considered permissible, you know, as just being an error and not being an actual kofar. But we'll look at that in a couple of weeks as well. You'll see if that does it for you, if you feel like there needs to be a little bit more structure there.
So what does Rambam say and the people who follow him say about the person who's brought up with no knowledge of Judaism? And I mean, certainly from a halakha point of view, it's recognized that you're not going to penalize that person if the person doesn't perform halakha because he had no background. So how does that apply in the realm of these beliefs?
Right. I think that one needs to develop one's intellect, that one needs, you know, like everybody might be starting from a different place, but I think without having the proper conceptions, then he would be excluded from Olam Haba without developing, you know, to the extent that he would be. That might be different for him than somebody who was, you know, brought up with more of a background, or more of, even from a philosophical perspective, not just from a Torah perspective, but yeah.
But if he had no background,
yeah,
he wouldn't know that he was obliged to develop his intellect to understand this.
That's true. It's true. I don't know that he doesn't specifically talk about it with regard to the Gimel Karim. You saw what he presents there and elsewhere. But I think just with regard to human perfection, that is what one needs to strive. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in line with the Torah to kind of follow that, you know, hierarchy of human perfection, from perfection of possessions, material, physical, moral, and then, you know, so perhaps once he develops his moral capacity, then he'll come to his intellectual capacity. With regard to, though, I guess that's probably how one could answer that, even with regard to in the kind of the perplex when he talks about prophecy, when he talks about the Aristotelian notion of prophecy, the prophet needs to develop his moral, rational, and imaginative faculties, and then according to Aristotle, he'll necessarily get prophecy, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be based on Torah values or Torah principles, right? Once one develops his metaphysical cognition, once one develops his physical understanding, right, then he could develop his intellect and connect with the active intellect. It doesn't necessarily have to be through, you know, following the mitzvot that he might not be familiar with.
But still, that presupposes that a person's got some reasonable background. But I don't get how you get to that approach for somebody who has had no background.
Right, but I'm saying, like, even without a Jewish background, meaning just an Aristotelian background, meaning in the people that Rambam was writing his Morna Buchim for in his community, in his generation, they were getting the Aristotelian philosophical knowledge, they were getting the traditional Torah knowledge, and that's why they were becoming perplexed. So even if they didn't have that traditional Torah knowledge, they still could be getting that philosophical influences that were pervasive at that time.
Even that position is assuming a certain level of background within the background, yes, but also within the context of the Jewish tradition, because it's assuming that you understand something about Judaism and that you understand something about Aristotelian philosophy and how the two might interact.
Right, but I'm saying that even without the understanding of Judaism, just the Aristotelian philosophical view is that if one develops his imaginative, rational, and and moral faculties, one will necessarily get prophecy. It was just the Jewish conception that said no, and then God could miraculously withhold it because God has to choose the prophet, right? So one could develop even outside of the Jewish tradition, one could develop his intellect, his understanding of physics and metaphysics without necessarily having the Jewish background and the Jewish upbringing to, kind of influence him to further himself in that realm. Again, in the time that Rambam was writing, in the culture, that was pervasive. I don't know that we could, think about it now, but many argue against Rambam, as we mentioned, because there was this kind of elite, that Olam Haba, or, that this is only, really accessible, to, or human perfection. Even some argue against that in the last chapter of the guide, that human perfection was only achievable for the intellectually elite. And, so we're going to see Chasdei Kreskas and Albo, they say, no, what really matters is the ma'asim, not the machshavot, and like if you, as long as you are well-intended, have the emotional, motivation and do the mitzvot, that's what ultimately will enable you to achieve Olam Haba. And so we are, again, Chasdei Kreskas is an anti-Aristotelian. He argues very much against Rambam, as we're going to see next week in a lot of different ways. Okay, have a wonderful week. And we'll look at Chasdei Kreskas as he responds to Duran, and certainly as he responds to Rambam next week. Have a great week. See you next week.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.